had this transformational moment, a start of a new decade, 2011, social media, Facebook, Twitter, internet, new generation. And we had a 30-year-old dictatorship fall. And for a moment, it felt that this is something truly special and transformational, and something great was on the cusp. And then it fell apart, right? So what happened? What happened in that moment? If you could just tell us from your experience.
So just to reiterate this point, obviously Tahrir was not a Twitter and Facebook revolution, right? I don't even refer to it as a revolution. I refer to it as an uprising. A revolution, like I said, means certain things insofar as what revolutionary movements are supposed to have done. And Tahrir did not just emerge overnight. There is a legacy of obviously, kifaya, in terms of the enough movement that had started quite some time before that, I believe 2005. And it was sort of a mixture of all kinds of political activists and so on. In terms of, enough insofar as Mubarak. Of course, you had, has the Mahalla, the protests, the larger worker strike that had also happened during that era and during that decade. So it's not something that happened phantasmally overnight. It coincided with Tunis, so it wasn't an order even that Tunis, then Egypt, then Libya, then Syria, and so on. I mean, again, that's a linear conceptualization of history that simply is very logocentric, Eurocentric, and just, it didn't happen that way, right? Sure, there were social media, but, signals that were being read, but it wasn't a social media revolution in terms of, different people in different nations taking cues from one another and so on and so forth. But this is where also the unlearned lessons happened, unfortunately. Right? Like Syrians, Libya did not learn from what happened in Egypt and Tunis, and the lessons in Sudan, same thing. There are lessons that are very much unlearned from the first wave. And there's a reason that Tunis still is in the place that it is, that Egypt ended up being in the place that it is, and that Syria and Libya just took on a whole different other trajectory. And now we see the same thing more or less with Sudan, which are proxy wars, right? So there are many ways that one can see this. Number one, let me just start off or go back to this point that Mubarak had cut out, the internet. So it wasn't a Facebook and Twitter revolution. It was very anarchistic in the context of Egypt specifically, because you had millions of people going down into the streets as soon as the electricity, let alone the internet, was cut off. We set up, community councils, neighborhood councils. Women were manning checkpoints, so you have a breakdown of gender barriers. Queer people even marched with the pride flag. There was an anarchist tent at Tahrir. The Muslim Brotherhood were there. The Copts were protecting Muslims as they prayed, and vice versa. Revolutionary socialists were there. Liberals were there. Nasrites were there. Sadatists were there. All united by one thing, let us remove the regicide, as I said earlier. So again, going back to this concept of Tawheed. But failing to have the conversations that we had one another, because again, revolutions involve practical questions. What are you going to do in terms of food? How are we going to run tomorrow in terms of health, police, military? And of course, it started off with Khalid Said, a middle-class Egyptian citizen, right, being beaten up to a pulp by police officers in Alexandria. Right? Now, Khalid Said is not the first example of a youth that was beaten up by the police. Absolutely not. But he was the first example of a middle-class youth. So it signaled a different strata within society of this is what can happen to you. Right? And this is how things began to spiral. Then, of course, Wael Ghunaim, who was involved with Google at the time, set up a website on Facebook. And people started to go out in the streets, to call out, to go out, to protest the police brutality, and so on and so forth. So even the ceiling of removing Mubarak did not exist at the time. But what you had was a bunch of political factionisms and parties and movements and ideas that were all living together for 80 days in Tahrir. And yes, there were incidents of thefts and sexism and so on and so forth, but certainly not as usually, to the extent and degree as usually happens within Egyptian society. There were battles with the police forces, so there was direct action, of course, but no plan for tomorrow. People didn't talk to one another. People were only united, again, by this idea of, oh, we're all Egyptian, and we're going to show the world without learning lessons from movements, radical movements, spiritual movements, social justice movements elsewhere. And so what took them is al-ghurur, what took them is pride, what took them is arrogance, or most of the Egyptian population. The Muslim Brotherhood, and if you asked two people, what is your vision of tomorrow, you got a different answer from the Muslim Brotherhood, let alone from within the Muslim Brotherhood, than you did from the Revolutionary Socialists, let alone the different factions within the Revolutionary Socialists, and so on and so forth, right? And of course, you had COINTELPRO tactics that were being deployed. I mean, the state is not asleep during this period in time either. And of course, you had the army following the 18 days being called by the majority of the Egyptian population, despite the fact that a lot of us had warned, insofar as so long as we are in Tahrir, so long as power is within our hands, that we're able to perhaps have these conversations. But there were a lot of people that actively did not, let alone on the left, did not want to have these conversations to happen, right? We refused to take up responsibility on the long term. What I mean by that is, all the youth in Tahrir, for instance, went and brought up the cleaning equipment and would literally get on their hands and knees and scrub Tahrir Square clean, right? Because there was a sense of ownership that, wow, like our public streets are really our streets, right? Up until the moment came that, no, this is not our responsibility. This is the responsibility of the garbage collector. Why should I care if I throw my cigarette or if I throw, my paper bag or plastic bag or whatever it is, or my Coke can and whatever into the street? Somebody there will just pick it up. So again, a refusal of politics of responsibility because of a reversion back into the state. Now, of course, there was a lot of complexities because the problem is with the scene and with revolutionary movements, particularly in the Arab Spring, is that they think, number one, they were relatively, as much as they were trying to piggyback off one another, but they were also arrogant locally, and they were naive with regards to the extent to which local, regional, and global forces were operating. This is not a joke for you to try and usurp or to take power, and this is the difference between seizing power and knowing what to do with the seized power after. Right? Okay, Mubarak is dead, a god is dead, therefore we all become demagogues vying for a piece of the pie, right? We all want a little bit of that share, right? And everybody thinks that they've got the answers and the solutions and, to hail this new dawn, if you will, this new pioneering dawn tomorrow. And they failed to recognize that, you had a military-industrial complex that was in power. You had a president that exists, well, he was a president then, that was head of intelligence at the time, who was destroying the lifelines, tunnels to Gaza by flooding them with sewage, by bombing them, chemical bombs, and otherwise explosives, and so on and so forth. He destroyed more tunnels and lifeline tunnels to Gaza than Mubarak had done over 20 years while we were in Tahrir. Right? So this is how serious. It takes a certain foresight, a certain strategy to understand revolution, to actually plan for it. And again, we can plan as much as we want. We can anticipate the moment, but there are certain lessons that we should have learned, while again, leaving room for al-ghayb, because we can anticipate when the moment is. The Zapatistas have a saying that holding each other's hands, we ask one another during a revolution what each of us knows, and this is how we build together. So there was a certain revolutionary spirit of Tahrir that was lost. We didn't take Tahrir to our factories. We didn't establish alternatives on the ground, etc. And everybody was trying to use the state as an instrument. But also, as I noted, there were forces within the military-industrial complex, the counter-revolutionary forces. There was also regional forces, the Gulf nations and the Gulf countries, right? There was at the time, and this is now where we need to understand geopolitics, because the best thinker, the best revolutionary is somebody that not only has the theory, the movement, as well as the movement experience, but also understands geopolitics really, really well. We have the Gulf nations, and we have a split within the Gulf nations between the Saudis, the Emiratis, as well as the Qataris, between the Muslim Brotherhood wing and between the secular wing of the Gulf nations that have tremendous influence on Egypt specifically, because again, Egypt has been the sort of nation, as much as it's a wellspring of pan-Arab, pan-Africanist, pan-Islamist thoughts, that's just part of its history and its geography. It straddles a very unique and exceptional space within the region and the Mediterranean and within the Swana region, right? And that influences everybody. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood influenced even Iran, let alone South Asian scholars and movements, right, over the course of decades. But the point being that Egypt has always held and has been holding its hand as it's a very neoliberal society. This is part of its openness and infitah that Sadat had opened the shift towards the West after he took power, and the Camp David peace accords with Israel. That was start of our devolution, if you will. But also, it has always relied on handouts from the Gulf states. And this was an opportunity for the Gulf states to assert its influence. On the one hand, Qatar supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, and on the other hand, of course, and Saudi Arabia still being somewhere in between there, at least at that particular moment, because at the time it was Abdulaziz that was still in power. Or Abdullah, sorry, that was still in power, King Abdullah that was in power, and he very much aligned with the Qatari axis. But then you had the United Arab Emirates that was anti-Muslim Brotherhood and aligned very much with the army. And this is where the split had happened. So for 3 years between 2011 or 2013, this was the height which, if you will, if you wanted to do any horizontal projects on the ground at that rear, so I was involved in a lot of queer and feminist abolitionist projects and knowledge centers and so on and so forth that were established then. And that was the period of time by which you would do it, because at that time, it was the major political parties that were contesting power, i.e. particularly the military, the liberals, primarily the Muslim Brotherhood. They were the ones that were at war with one another. Right. And then we had the elections of 2013. Then we discover, of course, and this is again the mass psychology of fascism, that movements as the Tamarrud movement, the rebel campaign, etc., was very much led by Egyptian intelligence as well as other regional intelligence forces, including to some extent even members of Israeli intelligence at a certain point, or at least it's been documented as such too. So let alone now global forces that we're talking about, the US. I mean, who wants to see Egypt collapse? Can you imagine the politics and the implications, the ripple effects that would happen? But then what was used as a scare, and if you notice around, again, and I don't want to be linear because I'm very much anti that around 2013, this is when we're beginning to see the implications. We have already seen the implications in terms of Libya and interventionist policies. There, militarized policies, Sarkozy, the US, so on and so forth. It's ironic that Obama goes now and sends out over his tweet all kinds of NGOs and local funding and global funding campaigns to help Libya that he helped destroy after what had happened because of both climate warming or climate change, forgive me, and global boiling, as Anthony Guterres had noted, after he helped destroy. And that doesn't mean that I condone, obviously, you know, Muammar Gaddafi, right? But Gaddafi was also a threat for certain reasons. Point is that this is where Libya and Syria became scare tactics that, listen, you know, any possibility and any thought outside the state form, forget that, because you know, you're going to have a proxy war. You're going to have a so-called civil war. Just look at Syria, look at Libya, and so on and so forth. So, and we see the manifestations, if you will, of the opposite of that to a certain extent more recently up in Tunis, and now Qais Said, who is a leftist, and so on. I mean, again, the reproduction of authoritarianism is manifesting itself in military ways, in Islamist ways, in secular liberal ways, right? And this becomes the problem. This is how Bashar al-Assad remains Bashar al-Assad, because, or otherwise you get a Daesh, because again, there isn't an alternate vision. Now, if you ask me up until 2016 or whatever, right? You know, I always refer to Bashar al-Assad as being the butcher of Damascus, but you ask me now, I say, please keep him in power, because I'm not interested in Syria being cordoned and divided into 3 different territories, Sunni, Shiite, Kurdish. It makes no sense. Or the same thing with Iran. That doesn't mean that I condone the mullahs or I accept what they're doing. And so far as sisters being forced and being treated, let alone murdered and killed because of the hijab and so on, that should be forced in the first place, because what's the point? Do you believe in Allah, or do you believe in the mullahs? Are you scared of the mullahs? Again, you can't have 2 intentions that are contradictory in one heart, right? This is where intentionality also becomes important. So this is part of the dilemma. People didn't have alternatives for us, or the alternatives that they had were strictly within myopic sense. They didn't involve them changing themselves, as we've been talking throughout almost, you know, these past 2 hours, right? Which is fundamental to revolutionary spirit. That if I'm going to argue for something that is revolutionary, I have to be willing to change myself. Muslims say this verse all the time. We read it every single Jummah. In Allah, God does not change a people until they change in and of themselves. So revolution is not something outside. It doesn't have to do with me removing a regime, removing a military, removing a whatever president. It has to do with me self-organizing myself, let alone in relationship to one others on the ground. Again, the original message of the Ummah, the original message with the Hijra, in which Muslims were being persecuted. And you're not going to include everybody. This idea of mass mobilizations and people are all going to change between a day and night, that's not going to happen either. That will all often enough lead to what Richard J. Day referred to as a hegemony of hegemony, this rise of a new elite class of authoritarians, of post-colonial elites, if you will. Even if they seem revolutionary, again, power will get to their head. You don't change the system changes you. So first, the Muslim Brotherhood were taken out. Of course, I was around Rabaa and Nahda and the massacres that occurred there. And this is to eliminate Islamism out of the equation completely, or to eradicate the element, because the thing with Egypt is, again, being the wellspring of pan-Arab and Islamist thought, for the longest time, even since Nasser, there have been contestations over who holds sway over the ownership of Islam and the narrative around Islam. So Nasser not only had an issue with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Ikhwan generally, but had an issue also with Al-Azhar University in certain respects, right? Because it's the ultimate adjudicator as this Ismaili institution that has become Sunni Orthodox, right? And obviously with Salahuddin, who, Sunniized it, this is when it had happened. Originally, it was an Ismaili institution. Oh, subhanallah. So, and now Ismailis are not even being considered to be Muslim. There's, again, something to think about historically speaking. But the same thing happened with Sadat, the same thing with Mubarak, although Sadat had opened it up to a various stream of different political parties so that they may, again, war with one another in a certain sense, and he maybe allowed Ray to do what it is that he had done, part of the reason for his assassination. And of course, then with Mubarak, absolutely, there was wiggle room given to the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on, not in any huge organized way, but nevertheless, they represented the only alternative that existed. But of course, they were neoliberal and they were capitalist and so on and so forth, right? But even the youth within the Muslim Brotherhood were very disillusioned with the leadership, right? Now you're looking at a situation, especially at the cusp of 2013, where, and this is where the war on terror very much intersects with all kinds of different discourses, right? Because sexual torture is being used within prisons and so on. And of course, the new prisons that are being built are being dubbed as humane, but they're built on the prisons that exist in the US. Like it's a nightmare, right? And you have over 70,000 political prisoners, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but liberals, leftists, queers, anarchists, Marxists, revolutionary socialists, all that are labeled held in arbitrary detention. So renewed without the need to recourse for a judge, without the need or the possibility of to actually be adjudicated, to stand in front of a court, right? It's just this endless, again, Kafkaesque postponement of judgment. And they're all labeled as terrorists because of, again, the military tribunals that everybody was exposed to. Again, this is why getting into a direct confrontation with the state was the stupidest, most naive, and people were purposely engaging in it. The joke was actually, and this is how, again, I'm telling you, it's a matter of egos, and this is the facade. And a lot of Egyptians, particularly on the left, are refusing to face the monsters in the mirror still. They have this idea, revisionist idea of history. I see a lot of articles written by leftists every single commemoration of 2013 now, right? And it's been a decade, that says, oh, the liberals did this, they sided with the army, and this group sided with the army and that group, but they refused to take honest for the fact that they too sided with the army because they were willing to do everything underneath the sun to remove the Muslim Brotherhood, right? Because of, again, how the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm not saying members of it, I'm not saying segments of it did not engage in scare tactics, but they became the taboo ghost that everybody is throwing out there to scare society into submission. And I'm not saying, again, that there aren't issues there and serious issues, right? Of course there were. But nonetheless, they became the scapegoat for everything. Why? Because, again, the left, animated by secularism, refused to have to deal with anything to do with spirituality and had internalized, and I get it. As a leftist, you grew up in Egypt, you've never been outside. Maybe you've been, but your home is Egypt, and you've never been exposed to anything but Orthodox conservative Islam. Why would you think any different than that it's possible to establish a leftist Islam or anything? I mean, I would have liked to think that these lefties that do read Marx would also maybe read Ali Shariati at the very least, or whatever, Kwame Ture, right? Or Sankara, and so on and so forth, or Lumumba, and so on and so forth, right? But there was this elitism to reproduce Marxist-Leninism, particularly, specifically here. And yeah, that is part of the problem, and internalized Islamophobia. There's no alternative to it. When I was proposing alternative readings, it was being dismissed. This is the kind of arrogance that I'm speaking of. But the joke was that if you wanted to become famous in Egypt, you would actually hand yourself over for arrest. And a lot of actually Egyptian activists did that. They handed themselves over, started a Twitter account, and became famous overnight. That was their logic, right? This is the ego getting out of control. I want to be a revolutionary leader. I want to be this and that, right? And this is what social media opened up in so many narcissistic, individualistic ways, right? So people have gathered up to 500,000, 1 million followers over Twitter, but what have they actually done? They have no educational background, and I don't mean to be elitist. I don't mean by education that you actually went to school. No, I mean that you've just read, at the very least, theory, you've read history, you've read praxis, you've been involved in organizing. But no, and by the way, organizing is more than just organizing a protest. I mean, this is organizing is much more than that, right? Again, it's about constructing alternatives. So these are parts of the facets that led to the unraveling, the fraying at the seam of Tahrir and the potentials and the possibilities with it, right? So it's quite sad. It's quite heartbreaking. Muslims played into it. The Muslim Brotherhood surely played into it. Everybody played into it, right? But again, between 2011 and 2013, if you ask even leftists, this was the time in which anybody could do whatever it is that they wanted. And so the irony is what happened after 2013 of the massacre, that this is when the clampdown on everybody started to happen. And again, the absence of foresight and strategy of the fact that what are you placing, again, a greater evil and who's lesser evil and so on and so forth. It depended on your relative perspective, right? And look at how everybody is suffering nowadays. It's not something, nothing remains permanent, but look at Egypt's debt rate. Now you're talking about almost $150 billion. You're talking about 60% underneath the line of poverty. You're talking about a middle class that's decimated. You're talking about a geography, Tahrir, that has completely been wiped and erased. And now there are monuments venerating the police in Tahrir, and all the graffiti that used to be on the walls, mocking all kinds of authoritarianism, be it religious, be it military, has been removed. There's a new capital city called the New Cairo, the new administrative capital. All the offices are now there. It's about 2.5 hours from Tahrir Square. So to remove that element of symbolism and a generation, like now you have, it's been what, 13 years? You have a generation, or 12 years? You have a generation of 12-year-olds who study in textbooks that 2011 was a Muslim Brotherhood conspiracy. And that 2013 was the military saving the revolution, it being the real revolution, right? So a complete amnesia, a complete rewriting of history. But this is what the dominant order is capable of doing. And we should know that already based on the experiments and the trial and errors. It's we that haven't opened up the horizon of our imaginations to imagine something different. But again, Egypt could not do its thing without a coordination. And this is where we come to revolutionary organizing. If we're talking about anti-authoritarianism, and we're not talking about seizing the state, and we're talking about an ummah of Muslims and non-Muslims alike that share spiritual and ethical commitments, right? You should have that Zapatismo, Islamatismo, call it whatever you want, model in every corner and pocket on earth, from Bangladesh to so-called Australia to New Zealand. And you have to have these pockets coordinated so that in a moment itself, when you become more threatening, it's when a cooperative, anarchistic, mutual aid, horizontalist, land back, abolitionist, collective, and, the Bay Area in California is connecting with a similar thing down in, Lenape territory in New York. And they discover ways by which they actually, you're making this in New York, we need this in the Bay Area. That's when you're actually disrupting not only actual state geographies, this so-called federalist model, but the nation state, settler state, because you're actually constructed an alternative market system based on free exchange, based on mutual aid, based on reciprocity, based on. So that when the moment comes, you're able to engage in a proper uprising without wanting to usurp power either. But the problem, and this is the thing, folks are not thinking at that level a degree. We are facing monsters, nation states. We're facing empire. We're facing, again, totalitarian China and Russia that use Islamophobia insofar as look at what had happened with regards to Chechnya, look at how the Uyghur are being treated, look at how even Buddhism has become militarized. Again, there's white supremacist forms of all kinds of spiritualities and religion insofar as Myanmar against the Rohingya, right? Look at what Hindutva is doing insofar as its white supremacy against Dalits, against Muslims, against Malayali people, against you name it, right? Kashmiris and so on and so forth. So Islamophobia is being used by everybody, by your America, but also one of these wonderful totalitarian regimes. This is the scale at which we need to be thinking and operating the forest through the trees that we're lacking because we can only look at what's beneath our feet. And so when, again, we go back to, oh, let's just elect Trump, that's looking right at our feet. We need to have that vision. And again, our revolutionaries' legacies endow us by example with that vision. We have to think big. So, and we have to act locally while thinking globally is the same. So, but yeah, these are part of the dimensions that ruined Tahrir, and with it, obviously, a lot of other potentials and spirits in the meanwhile, including in the recent contemporary like Sudan. So,
well, yeah, I mean, thank you for your analysis of what happened there, and I hope that this kind of analysis and this kind of insight allows us to learn, and not repeat the mistakes of the past and learn, for future.